Welcome to episode number 15 on the My Story podcast. The My Story podcast features interviews with leaders, influencers, and entrepreneurs who tell us their story and the life lessons they've learned along the way. Hi, my name's Conrad Weaver, and I'm the host for the show. I'm a filmmaker, entrepreneur, storyteller, and today I'm honored to feature my interview with my good friend and mentor, Richard Pollock. Richard is an award-winning journalist, investigative reporter, and television producer who spent years covering Washington, D.C. politics and news for Good Morning America, Fox News, The Washington Examiner, and a number of other news organizations. We'll hear the story of the change in his political point of view from being a left-wing anti-war activist in the 70s to becoming a conservative-minded reporter who believes in the America we once knew and loved. Richard's Jewish faith and upbringing helped shape his view of America and continues to guide the type of stories he investigates and writes about. The interview is fascinating, and I know you'll love the stories he tells. Some of them are quite poignant. Plus, at the end of the interview, Richard gives us a prediction of who will win the 2020 presidential election. So you need to stick around for his interesting take on that. Hey, if you enjoy listening to these podcasts, first of all, thank you for joining us. If you enjoy these, then please share it with your friends and family. I really would love you just to share it with everyone you know and encourage them to listen as well. And if you haven't already left a review, go over to Apple Podcast and leave me a review. Let me know what you think, what you like, what you don't like. I really do want to know what you're thinking when you listen to these podcasts. So if you could do that, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. So thanks for joining me today, and here's my conversation with Richard Pollock. So Richard, welcome to the My Story podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. Richard, you and I go back a few years.
We do.
And I have to say, to start out, I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking, a lot of the things that I do in video production, I really look back to my early experience with you, and I look at you as a real mentor in my professional experience in video production.
Well, that's very impressive. I'm very impressed. You are in your own right now, I think, a recognized national producer of really great topics, usually topics that are sort of under appreciated. I know that you work in the whole issue of the Farm Belt, and America's farmers was just sort of
Right.
a very pioneering kind of effort. So I'm just very happy to be associated with you and of your success that you've had professionally.
Well, thank you. And I think one of the things that I really learned from you in one of the early times that we were working together is just your interview skills and how you performed an interview with someone, of someone of importance. And I learned a lot from that time. And so I want to say thank you. Thank you for hiring me, for taking me under your wing, so to speak, and teaching me some things that I didn't really know otherwise.
Well, I think storytelling is very powerful. It's something that you do now for sure. But storytelling is not just sort of it doesn't come natural to a lot of people. It's how we take sort of abstract issues like policy or a national crisis, and we actually put it in terms that average people, they may be very informed and very smart, but that average people who are not associated with this issue can bond with it. They can understand either the advocates for a point of view or people who struggle about issues. And I think that storytelling is really an unappreciated type of skill that I've seen that you've developed. And I think that's a big part of your success.
It's been a really fun journey for me, and I'm still in the middle of the journey and still learning. I learn, something new every day, it seems. And in storytelling, I've really learned to appreciate that art of storytelling, and I've gotten better over the years, thankfully. And I think my films can speak to that. But, I want to really talk about you and where you have come from. And so I want to learn a little bit about Richard Pollock. Where did you get your start? Where were you born? And And where did you come from?
Well, I was the firstborn of three children. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, to parents who were Jewish. I grew up in a Jewish household. It wasn't that orthodox at all, but we were living at the time in a neighborhood which was appropriately called a Jewish neighborhood, because we would walk out of the apartment building and we would find that there would be a kosher butcher, there would be a kosher baked goods, there would be, and I, as a little child, even one or two, when I was learning words, I learned the word kosher that was in neon lights in front of every shop that had some sort of Jewish connection. And I didn't even understand that nobody else had that, by the way.
Mm.
I just thought this was like something that was interesting. And what was also interesting is we lived in a neighborhood in which supermarkets had not yet come to this part of Newark, New Jersey, which is a very big metropolitan area.
Mm.
And so I would go with my mother from one little store to another, probably the way that they did it for most of life, going to the marketplace, wherever it might have been, in Europe or Africa, Asia, wherever it might be. And I loved it. I learned a lot about food, but also about people and about community. And that was really very powerful to me. And then we moved to a nearby town in which, as it turns out, my grandparents were 3 blocks away. My uncle and aunt were 2 blocks away. A number of other uncles and aunts were within 3 or 4 blocks. And I learned something else that I think we've lost in suburbia, and that is the connection of growing up in a safe place with safe adults, with safe parents and relatives. And I was put on the public bus by my mother every morning to go to elementary school. This was not a school bus; it was a public bus.
Oh, wow.
You had to pay the money to the driver. He knew me, of course, and there were other little kids on there. We're talking like I'm going to kindergarten. I'm like talking about 6 years old, and they would drop me off and at the elementary school. And I was born in 1951, which it seems like it's still sort of like a modern period, but for some reason, all of these bonded me. It drowned me. It made me grounded by feeling like I was part of a community and relatives were part and surrounding me, and so a lot of the anxiety like today's generation has about different types of offenses that might trigger some sort of like subliminal fear and anxiety. I had none of that. I lived in a very happy community, and both communities, well, particularly the second community in Orange, was very integrated. I'd say that about almost half of the student body in Orange was African American or Hispanic. And so
do you think that this is like you had family around you, you had uncles down the street, you had cousins nearby. Do you think that's more traditional, typical Jewish communities, or was that just the way it was back in that time period?
I think it was the way it was back because, nearby there were Italian neighborhoods and there were Irish neighborhoods, and the Irish, the Italians, and the Jewish kids all used to like fight with each other. And, so I think this was really sort of like, it all happened in different places at different times. But yes, America was still a melting pot, but it was also one in which you had safety in numbers and you weren't fearful. And when we moved to Plainfield, New Jersey, I could go, this was a suburb now, and I could I could ride my bicycle anywhere I wanted to go at any time. And my parents didn't have to know where I was. I didn't have to go and report to people. There were no off limits. We had like a wooded area in which all us little boys would play guns, war and all that kind of stuff. And it was up through the early 1960s, America was a very safe place for a lot of people. Now, of course, there were probably a lot of people who wasn't safe, including Jews, I might add. There was great discrimination in housing. Jews could not move buy houses in certain neighborhoods. They couldn't go to certain colleges. The Ivy League schools had quotas, very strict, low quotas on the number of Jewish students they would accept. So I'm not saying it was all hunky-dory. There were real challenges. As it turns out, my my father-in-law made a business out of selling commercial insurance to Jewish businesses because the big insurance companies refused to underwrite these
Oh,
small
wow.
businesses. And so he became wealthy because he was able to provide insurance that the big insurance companies,
Mhm.
it was all quiet, never said. But we didn't demonstrate in the streets or anything of that sort. What we did is
Right.
we were taught to learn about education and be serious at school and uplift ourselves so that we were the best that we could be. And really, a lot of Jews became very successful in all sorts of realms of
Mhm.
American society just by their own grit and their effort. And, to a certain extent, this is where I feel like we're in like a grievance society today. We're just complaining about, I don't have this right and this right. Well, there were a lot of rights Jews in the 1950s and 1960s didn't have either. And what we did is we worked to go and get the laws changed, but also we worked very hard to fit into American society and add to American
Mhm.
society. And that kind of issue that we were Americans and we were here to go and contribute to our society was a very deep felt set of values that I learned. And
Boy, those values are really missing today in a lot of ways.
they're gone. I mean, those values are really gone. Although I have to tell you, if you ever meet a new immigrant in the United States, whether they're working in a kitchen or they're driving a taxi cab, many of them say they come here because there was opportunity that they do not have in their home countries, and that this opportunity is only based on hard work. In other words, it's not
Sure.
what religion you have or what ethnic background you have. They get it that if they work hard as a taxi driver, they will get up and up and up into the world, and maybe they'll become professional at some point. A lot of them have college degrees and came
Mhm.
here and work doing menial work, but they hope to get into the area
Mhm.
of the world that interests them. Look at the Asian communities, how well they've integrated and how they excelled in this society. I think that the
Mhm.
Jewish and the Asian communities really had something very similar of stressing education and learning in our background. Anyway, these were all very important values that I do think are really missing today.
Mhm.
There's no question.
Boy, it sounds like that would be a great documentary.
I think that it's
Maybe
very
we could work together on that, right?
yeah, maybe it's where the thing is that there were there were Cambodians and Laotians and Vietnamese that came after the end of the Vietnam War, and the communists were expelling all
Mhm.
these people and putting them into concentration camps, which they called education camps. There was an earlier group of Koreans and Chinese that came, but there also were, as I said, earlier in the American 20th century, we had Irish and we had Germans and we had Jews and all sorts of people. One of the things that's very interesting about our country is that Philadelphia was founded by Quakers, but Quakers were pacifists and they didn't want to fight. And in order to go and keep themselves secure, they needed to be able to fight against the Indians who would be
Mhm.
attacking, swarming down on their little colonies and little settlements. So they brought the Germans from Germany
Mhm.
over to Philadelphia. And they also were from northern Germany, which were a lot of coal mines, and they began working in the coal mines. But the Germans actually created, they were not pacifists, and they created little armies to protect the Quakers. And that area of Philadelphia today is still called Germantown.
Wow.
It gives you an
Mhm.
idea of just, what a mixing bowl we've been, but
Right.
all of us have understood our American identity. They didn't have a hyphenated identity. We weren't
Mhm.
Jewish Americans. We were just Americans.
Mhm.
You weren't Irish Americans. You really were Americans, and they wanted to be Americans. And they also wanted to do it legally. I mean, the issue of illegal immigration is really a very, very recent development. It has not
Right.
been with us for a long
Right.
time.
So what got your interest in journalism?
Well, of course, I loved Walter Cronkite. My family and I would watch the 6 o'clock or 6:30 CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, and we grew up with Uncle Walt, as some people
Mhm.
called him. And I saw him, and I said, I want to be like him. I want to be in the news business. This is great business. And
Mhm.
so I became I got involved in my high school newspaper. I became the first junior to actually be the editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper. Usually
Wow.
it was a senior who was there. So for 2 years, I was the editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper. And then came to AU, American University, Washington, D.C. for college. And I got involved with the student newspaper, but I also got involved in some politics too, the anti-war movement, and that got me very involved. And it actually gave me, it detoured me from journalism. But then I guess when I was about 21, I was not doing any journalism professionally at the time. And the woman that I was dating said, "What do you really want to do?" I mean, and I said, "What do you mean, what do I really want to do?" She, "No, really, tell me what you really want to do." And I said, "Well, I'd love to be a journalist." So she said, "Well, figure out a way to do it." So there was actually a independent freelance organization of freelance writers in Washington, D.C., and there was a subgroup of investigative reporters, and I joined the organization. I eventually became a member of the board of directors called Washington Independent Writers, and I came up with a story idea. I pitched it to a news organization, and I couldn't believe it. They said, "Okay, go write it." I went, "That's it? Go write it?" So I began writing, and I wrote for the Village Voice for a while. I wrote for a number of other small publications. I actually broke a couple of very big stories as an investigative reporter, and someone noticed me, and it turned out that Ralph Nader was looking for an investigative reporter, and he put me in touch with Nader, and Nader hired me, and I was there for 6 years.
Wow. Then you went on to work for ABC.
Right. Well, actually, I had one little detour. A friend of mine who I knew, who was a political activist, had created a public relations company, and he wanted to know if I wanted to be the head of his Washington office. He had no Washington office. He was in New York. And I said, okay. And so I did that for 6 years. And that was also a detour because I really didn't want to be in PR pitching stories. I really wanted to be a reporter. Mm-hmm. So as it turns out, I created my own PR firm and left him. And then I sold that company to a company called APCO, which is very big today. I was there for about a year, and I decided, let's stop this PR stuff, go back into journalism. And I decided that just like looking at Walter Cronkite, I wanted to be in television, which was I didn't have any television experience, but I just wanted to do it. And I'd done a lot of news conferences with a lot of nationally known reporters who attended my news conferences. So I knew them personally. So I called up a friend of mine at CBS, and he put me in touch with the bureau chief, and they offered me a job at CBS Radio. And I said, no. Now, at the time, that was really gutsy and, sort of arrogant in a way. I mean, CBS Radio was not a small radio network.
Sure.
But I realized that the gulf between radio and TV was enormous. If you started in radio, you never left radio.
Right. You were kind of stuck in that mode of communication.
It's very rare. You could jump, but it was very rare. So I actually turned down they called it the Tiffany Network. That's what CBS was known as at the time. I turned them down, and I got in touch with a guy named Jack McWethy, who was then the State Department reporter for ABC. And I asked him if I could take him out to lunch, what I'd never done. And I sit down with him, and after 5 minutes, he turns to me, so do you want to work at ABC? And I sort of laughed because that's what I was calling him for lunch. And I said, well, yeah, maybe. I don't know. Do you think I could do it? Is it possible? So he says, listen, I'm going to call George Watson, the bureau chief, and I'm going to tell him that, all the stuff that you've done. And in fact, Watson had attended 2 of my news conferences that I held in D.C., as it turns out. And so it took 3 months to get that interview, but finally it happened, and I had my resume in my pocket. But apparently he knew me, and Jack McWethy's recommendation also was very important. So about 10 minutes into the conversation, he says, "How would you like to work at Good Morning America?"
Oh, wow.
Could you just imagine that you're just sitting there? Anybody in America listening to this right now would say, somebody says, "How would you like to work at Good Morning America?" I don't want to see your resume. Give me your references. Can you fill out this test? And I said, well, yeah, I'd love to. And he says, well, there's a job opening for Washington producer here and Booker, and I think that you would do very well. Let me see. I'm going to send your name up. And he sent it to New York to a guy named Steve Friedman, Steve Lewis, I'm sorry, Steve Lewis, who was a senior producer of the show. And I actually had booked a number of guests with Steve in the past of my PR days.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew exactly who I was. And so on Monday, I met with George Watson. On Wednesday, I was in New York meeting not only Steve, but I met the executive producer, Jack Riley. I met Joan London, and I met Charlie Gibson. And now I'm like totally psyched. Like, I want to be here. This is amazing. So they said they'd give me an answer by 5:00 on Friday. And I said, okay. And this is like a very good example for all people who are like trying to like, break into some form of a field that they love. Anyway, 5:00 had come on Friday. I had not heard from them. And now I am really depressed. On Monday, I didn't even know there was a job. Now I'm like really depressed. So I called my best friend, a guy, and I said, let's go to Georgetown. Let's get drunk. I figured, I lost it. I went for the gold ring. I didn't get it. Maybe there's another brass ring I'll get later on. Who knows? So I'm packing the car in on M Street. And I actually there was such a thing as car phones at that time. And I had a phone in my car, and I'm backing up on M Street, which is a very crowded street, on Friday night at rush hour. And the phone rings, and I notice the number is the ABC number. So I pick up the phone, and Pat, his secretary, said, "Have you heard anything?" I said, "No, I haven't heard anything." She goes, "Wait a minute, hold on." So the front of my car was I'm like holding on, and I'm like completely oblivious that the front of my car, in trying to parallel park, is like stuck in the front of M Street, and all these people are honking because I'm honking at them. And finally I go, "Oh, okay." And I pull it in, and I'm waiting forever. And then he gets on the line, and he goes, "Richard?" And it goes, "Yes." And he's talking like the kind of talk you want to let a person down.
Oh, sure.
Like, you didn't have enough experience, but you have the right spirit. We invite you to apply, some other times. Go, "Richard?" I go, "Yes." And he goes, I guess I may be the first to say to you, welcome to ABC News.
Wow.
And he said, they're going to call you on Monday, and they're going to want some paperwork, and they're probably going to want to fly you up and go and finalize all the paperwork. But you have to settle on the salary. I've already told them the range. They've agreed with that. I'm going, oh my God. And so I leave the car. My friend is expecting a very depressed Richard Pollock. And instead, here is this guy. I said, "I got the job." And
so now you're buying rounds for everybody, right?
Exactly. And I had that position for almost 9 years. And I was the Washington producer in charge of what Good Morning America would cover, but I also was the White House producer and the Pentagon producer. And I covered both Presidents Reagan, George Bush, and Bill Clinton. And I also, at the Pentagon, I covered a bunch of different wars. I covered the first Gulf War from Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. I went to North Africa and to the Middle East to cover a bunch of terrorist stuff. I was in Panama covering an attempted coup d'etat against Noriega. Sent to Nicaragua during an election where the Sandinistas were trying to go and win the election there. I was in Hong Kong for 3 months to prepare for a special Good Morning America special in Hong Kong itself. I went to a G7 summit in Tokyo. And then I covered all sorts of, events in the United States, as well as a number of inaugurations that I was in charge of from the Washington point of view, booking all the different guests that we would have on, et cetera, et cetera. So I grew up, in the center of Washington's news and controversies and politics, and it was just probably one of the best times of my life.
What would you say was probably your favorite interview that you did during those years?
Well, there were lots of interviews, but I'm going to tell you one story. It was when the Berlin Wall had come down. A lot of people remember that. And it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we have a show tomorrow. And of course, this is the big news. I mean, almost 3/4 of the show was probably going to be about this and not about cooking segments or fashion segments or actors and actresses. We have nobody. So London is on, and London says, just a second. They get off and they say, we have the mayor of Berlin. And they go, okay, great. We'll start with the mayor of Berlin. And then my phone rings, And it's a State Department saying that the State Department Secretary of State, James Baker, would be willing to be on our show tomorrow. So I said, I get back on. I said, great. So we say, okay, we're going to start with Baker. And then the phone rings again, and this guy says, Richard Pollock, please. And I'm saying to myself, I've heard this voice before. Where have I heard this voice before? And then I just say, President Ford? He goes, yes, how are you? I understand you'd like me to be on Good Morning America tomorrow. I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I'm very happy to be on your show tomorrow. What time would you like me?
Wow.
Now, I'm like, oh, my God. I got former president. But the other piece, which was really never really picked up, was what a down-to-earth human being Ford was, that he called himself. He didn't have a press secretary.
Wow.
He called himself. He told me that he was going to stay at this hotel, and he would tell them that we need a crew and we need a room, and he knew how to do all of this stuff.
Sure.
And he gave me his phone number and the phone number of one aide, and he said, "What time do you want me?" And I just figured we should have to open it up, because he actually said he'd been to the Berlin Wall many times with his wife Betty, and he's saying it to me in just like this wonderful conversational tone, and I said, thank you very much. I hung up and I came back and I said, President Ford has agreed to be on our show. So in the course of 15 minutes, all of a sudden our show was like taking shape. And the thing is, you would say the first interview, well, this is the first arranging of interview that I've always remembered that moment when I hear this voice and I'm trying to put it, we've all been in that situation where there's somebody we've heard, we can't place it, and then the little light bulb goes up and I go, President Ford? Wow. That was really great.
Did you ever just wake up and say, wow, I get to do this?
Yes, and they paid me for it too.
That's even better, right?
The other thing that I was very proud of is I was asked to put together Good Morning America's live 50th anniversary coverage of D-Day, live from Normandy, France, and they gave me 3 months to put this show together. So, of course, we just had the 75th anniversary, so you can figure how long it's been since I've been on Good Morning America. But I got to meet all these principals. For those who are old enough to remember that there was a trio of women who were singing during the war called the Andrews Sisters. Well, I interviewed one of the Andrews Sisters, surviving one Andrews sister. I interviewed a German Nazi general who was in charge of the Panzer tank unit closest to the D-Day Normandy area. And he explained on camera how he wired back to Berlin and kept on saying, I think this is the main invasion. And they kept on saying to him over 3 days, no, it's not. Just stay put. It's going to be in another part of France, which was part of a whole disinformation campaign and psychological warfare campaign that the Allies had done for over 2 years to go and convince them that Normandy was not the landing place. And I interviewed all sorts of parachuter people from the 101st Airborne and the 82nd Airborne who dropped on that night before. And I also interviewed reporters who actually covered D-Day. And so it was really, I'm a military historian as an avocation, as a hobby. And so the idea of not only covering the D-Day and all of its wonders, but to actually sit down with 20, 30, 40 different people who actually were participants in that war was for me, it was like a little kid in a toy shop, and yet they were paying me to do this too. So,
Wow, that must have been just an amazing experience to hear firsthand from the people who were there.
Oh, yes. We did both on-air interviews, but we did also some, we talked after we were off camera about a variety of things. I will tell you one very, very poignant moment. I was actually, my production area was at the American Cemetery, and I was sitting next to David Brinkley, who he was coming live from the American Cemetery, and I was working the show from there too. And before we went on the air, there was this family and this big guy is walking, and he's looking at different tombstones, and the whole family must be 12, 15 people. His wife, his kids, his grandkids are all sort of following, and he's looking, and I'm just sort of noticing that. And all of a sudden, not far from where we are, I see this big man fall to his knees and begin sobbing. just sobbing, and the family was paralyzed. Like, what do we do? Obviously, he was the patriarch of the family. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
He was, and they were all there. And so after he composed himself, I went down to meet him and to talk to him. And I said, tell me, why are you here? And he says, well, I landed on this beach with my best friend, and we were both 19 years old, and he died on this beach.
Wow.
And I've had an entirely full life. Look at my family here. I have all these children. I have a wife. I have other family. I've had a very nice business in my life. I've lived for 50 years in which he has not lived one day beyond that. He died on this beach, and I wanted to. I'd never been to the American Cemetery in France, and I wanted to go and say my goodbyes to him and find him. And I finally found him. And this was a great, release point for me to just bond with him and what my life has become and what his life wasn't.
Wow.
in sacrificing for his country. So that was like a very powerful experience that I had, even though it never made air. We didn't have a camera crew. We had to do it or anything, but I just went and I said, my God, I've been just so privileged to have this kind of experiences in my life.
Mhm.
I'm like a nobody, really. I mean, I'm not a household name. People don't know my name for the most part. They do know from my bylines with some of the reporting I did over the last couple of years. But really, I've been blessed in terms of the opportunities that I've had.
Mhm. So you're a person of Jewish faith, and you spoke about that. And I don't find a whole lot of people who are Jewish who are in the conservative camp. So
Right.
how did you get there?
Well, first of all, I was a very young left-wing activist. I actually was in a study group, which was called a Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong study group. I was an anti-war radical. I actually had as a roommate during those days one of the defendants of the Chicago 7 trial, which was an infamous trial that followed the riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. His name was Rennie Davis. He was one of really 8 defendants, and one of the defendants was removed from the case. But in any event, I lived with him, and I met all sorts of other left-wing people. I met Tom Hayden. I met Jane Fonda. I met William Kunstler, the big left-wing lawyer. But I wasn't un-American. And a lot of the left, even then, were very un-American. They were ashamed of their country, and they were ashamed of what they did in the war in Vietnam. And I was a very big activist in the war. As a student, I was on the national board of directors of a thing called the People's Coalition for Peace and Justice. I never really was ashamed of my country. I actually was proud of it, but I thought Vietnam was a mistake. Mm-hmm. Not my friends. They felt that America was inherently wrong, unjust, criminal, supported a immoral economic system called capitalism. And I sort of like drank a little bit of the Kool-Aid and sort of agreed with some of it until at the Republican National Nominating Convention, Jean Kirkpatrick, who was then a Democrat, gave a speech called the Blame America Crowd, in which she said that anything that happens in the world, there's this crowd of left-wingers who will always blame America. It doesn't even matter if whether or not we really played a role in it. They would always find a way to blame us. And as this speech, which was a brilliant speech, was unfolding, I began to recognize that I had really been drinking this Kool-Aid and that this is not me, that I am a very patriotic American. We have a wonderful society. We have one of the oldest functioning democracy, but also there's just so many different opportunities in this society. This is not the kind of country that I felt the left had personified. And so I was sort of troubled by that. And then when I got to ABC, when you call up and you say to anybody, I'm from ABC, can I talk to you? Can do an interview, phone interview, whatever, meet you, everybody accepts it, everybody, no matter what the persuasion. And
because it's ABC.
That's right. Many years later, and now I'm at ABC, and I'm talking to a lot of conservatives, and I find that conservatives, for the most part, had a much more modern and up-to-date critique of where we were in American society than my friends on the left. My friends on the left were still steeped in the New Deal. kind of interesting that they've now raised it to Green New Deal. And also Johnson's, war on poverty, and that these were all the successes, when in fact all the objective criteria is that many of these federal programs have failed and actually created and some people, a feeling of dependency rather than, getting you on your feet so you can be independent and have a good full life for yourself and your family. So over time, I began to really get into this. And then I was invited to be a senior producer at Fox News Sunday with Tony Snow. I accepted it, and this was when Fox News channel was really being created, and this was we were creating together the Washington Bureau, and all of these people from CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, who were, we all knew each other. We didn't realize that we were conservative. And we would point at each other, like, you're here? And it's like a smile on them. Oh my God, I had no idea. So a lot of conservative producers, I was a producer, and reporters began to migrate to Fox News. And then after Fox, I was asked by the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, if I would be their senior vice president for communications. And I said, okay. So I did that. And there I learned a lot. That was like a college graduate level stint for me. I was there for 4 years. And that's where I began to learn about free market economics and free market ideas, and how they were so different than the command and control, government wants to go and control your whole life thing of the left. That was my final intellectual break from the issue of liberalism versus conservatism. And there's probably a third of Jewish Americans who are conservative, but still that means that you have 60%, 2/3 who are very much liberals, and it is still a liberal community, and we are a distinct minority within the Jewish community to be conservative and Jewish. It's not, we're like a minority within a minority.
So does that bring some conflict within your groups that you hang with?
Well, it means you have to keep your mouth shut sometimes during family reunions or dinners and things of that sort. And that's also true. I think it's important. I know that you're in Frederick, Maryland, just outside D.C. For those who are not inside D.C., D.C. is a very democratic city. I think that 97% of the voting public in D.C. voted for Hillary Clinton. When George McGovern lost to Richard Nixon in 1972, and Richard Nixon won 49 states, and the only two states that McGovern carried was Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. And so it's not just even a Jewish thing. Being conservative in a really very blue area is difficult for all conservatives that stick it out here.
Right. And it's, in Maryland as well. I mean, we have the unique stance of being a blue state with a Republican governor right now, who's very popular. But, we often say, we're conservative. I'm actually registered independent, but I typically vote on the conservative side. And we often say that, when it comes to national elections, our vote really doesn't count because we have Montgomery County, PG County, Baltimore, all those areas that really carry the bulk of the votes in our state.
Well, it's funny you say that because I am currently registered as a Democrat in D.C. And the reason why I am is because we have a primary system where only Democrats can vote for Democrats and only Republicans can vote for Republicans in the primary.
Right.
So the Republicans never win, and you cannot cross over and vote in a Democratic primary if you're Republican. Now, in Virginia, for example, they have an open system where Republicans can vote in primaries for Democrats and Democrats can vote in primaries for Republicans. You registered so you can go and support any primary candidate that you want. But here you are totally disenfranchised, and the Republican Party, I'm sad to say, is really kind of a broken machine here in D.C. So the only vote that counts is who wins the primary. If the primary, and they're all Democrats, so it'll be Democrats against Democrats here. And so if you want to have any input, you need to be a Democrat. I was an independent for 2 or 3 years, and then I couldn't vote in either the Republican or the Democratic primary.
Yeah, that's what I face here. And so I'm kind of reconsidering that at this point.
Yeah, because you're totally disenfranchised, and and most of the conservative states in this country have open primaries, and most of the blue states, not all, but most of the blue states have the situation you and I are facing, which is if you're an independent, you are disenfranchised. You can't vote in either the Republican or Democratic primary. It's crazy.
So in your investigative reporting, what or how do you choose the topics, or are those topics chosen for you as you go into a particular story?
I have been very blessed. I've worked in the last 6, 8 years for both the Washington Examiner and the Daily Caller. And in both of those cases, I was the one who chose the story. So whatever interests me, I would go to my editor, and they had to approve it, of course. But usually if I saw something that seemed weird, I would go to them and I say, I think this is weird. Can I go, dig into it? And they'd say, okay. So I wrote an awful lot. And I think a lot of people believe a lot of the groundbreaking coverage of the Clinton Foundation and of the of who gave them money and how they basically had no auditing capability whatsoever during the entire time that they were bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars, not only from the U.S., but from overseas interests, from Saudi princes, from all sorts of tycoons and autocrats. And it was just a lot of dirty money going in there. And then, of course, I also began getting into the Clinton email problem, where Hillary had this email server in the basement of her house in Chappaqua, New York, in which there was no federal government oversight. It was an open system. It had the kind of Norton antivirus that you and I might have had at that time, except that all of her work, all her government secrets and classified information was going through that. I was the one who broke the story that the Chinese had hacked into her system, and they had created a malware into her email server in which a courtesy copy, a duplicate copy, was produced exactly the moment that she received the original copy, and it was sent to this other entity, which was a Chinese state-owned enterprise operating in the United States, and they sent it on to Beijing. So the entire 4 years that she was Secretary of State, China and many of my intelligence sources tell me that Russia was hacking it, Nigeria was hacking it, the Israelis may have been hacking it, that she had an open party line in which all sorts of foreign governments and hostile foreign actors were breaking into her server and finding out all this stuff about our diplomatic actions, our military plans, appointments, treaties, you name it. That all was just an open book for a lot of the enemy states in this world. And she just sort of there's some discussion now whether or not she and her aides should be held accountable for this. But so far that she's not been held accountable. If you had been a low-level or mid-level government employee in a diplomatic or national security capacity and you did what she did, you would be fired, you would be displaced, and you probably would be in prison for a very long time.
Right. So do you live your life looking over your shoulder and breaking all these stories?
Yeah, we all of us do. And I will tell you that I have been awarded a license in the District of Columbia to carry a concealed weapon. Mm-hmm. By the way, the week that I was getting it from the D.C. Police Department, Tucker Carlson also was awarded a concealed carry license too. And there are other conservatives that have done that. I've never had to use it. I've never really gone around in the city with a loaded gun. Right. But I just want to know that if I need to, I can do it. Mm-hmm. And of course, I keep it at the house. I got a variety of different, I've never gotten a serious threat posed. There are lots of really nasty stuff, but thankfully I've never really gotten the kind of stuff that other conservatives have faced.
So you have to have pretty tough skin.
You have to have pretty tough skin. You have to feel, that this is really America, where you can think about whatever you want to think, that our there are certain things that are regulated in terms of our actions, but in terms of our thoughts, we are still, maybe precariously, but we are still a country that tries to honor independent thought, and that we should be able to have it without any kinds of fears of repercussions or of people attacking you, which happens in other countries outside the United States. Now, that is changing because we're seeing lots of different conservative speakers, for example, on college campuses who are being booed down, or where they're canceled because they fear for the safety of these conservative speakers on America's college campuses. I mean, this is outrageous.
It's crazy.
That this can happen in the United States of America.
Right. It's like the one side doesn't, wants their voice to be heard, but, God forbid you have the other side to come in to speak and to share their opinion.
And the other thing is that it's also affecting the Jewish American community, because there are overt anti-Semitic actions and comments and demonstrations erupting on a lot of colleges, including our Ivy League schools. In fact, I think our Ivy League schools are most permissive in allowing anti-Semitic speakers and advocates who are hate-filled toward Jews to be on those campuses. I find that to be completely amazing. Not only is this free speech not honored, but on top of it, you have the resurrection of hating the Jew, which was, has been like something you thought that we eradicated here in the United States in the 20th century. But no, it's coming back. We even have Representative Omar, who has said outrageous things on the wells of the Congress and the floors of the Congress, and then when Nancy Pelosi tried to reprimand her, the Democratic left-wing and Congressional Black Caucus and Women's Caucuses united to go and thwart it, and there was never any reprimand of Congresswoman Omar. And she's just getting more brazen with every every week. And
so, where do you think that hatred or that bigotry is coming from?
Well, I think some of it's coming from the hatred of Israel. The Palestinians have been very good at portraying themselves as a third world victim. They consider Israel to be a colonial European outpost and part of imperialism, that it is anti-democratic, that it is oppressing the Palestinian people. And the left has always been interested in just, embracing any kind of oppressed people. And, quite frankly, it is totally an intellectual dead end if you really want to have a real discussion about the Middle East and Israel. Remember, Israel is the only country in the entire Middle East that has regular elections. It is the only country that has a complete free press. It is the only country that allows demonstrations by anyone. It's the only country that allows Muslims, a different Jewish and ethnic group, to be elected to the legislature and have, and there's 10 to 12 members of the Israeli Arabs that are in the Knesset, in their legislature, as full members. There are members of the Israeli Arab community in the court system, including on their Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, the Israeli Arabs have been able to go before the court, petition it, and they've been able to overrule injustice when it's been determined by their Supreme Court and their court system. This is a far cry from all the other corrupt and anti-democratic and totalitarian societies that surround it. And to think that this country that has a rule of law is an oppressor, and that of the Palestinian people, there's a polling that's done every month by some very prominent polling companies. And the Palestinian community, the last time that there was an election for Abbas, who was the president of, and still is the president, the last time that Abbas won an election was 2005, and then he's canceled every scheduled election from 2005 to today. And have we heard anything from the European Union or from democratic-loving people about the fact that they have a dictator in which there's been no elections whatsoever? And when you go to the polling companies, they show that 82% of the Palestinians believe that Abbas, their leader, is undemocratic, is corrupt, and that they think that he's not worthy of being their president. And we don't hear that contrast between the so-called regime that's governing the Palestinians and the Israeli government that has such robust debate in it. And yet, people want to take the Kool-Aid that because Europeans fled after the Holocaust, European Jews fled to Israel for safety purposes, that it is now a European outpost is ridiculous. It's a Jewish outpost for Jewish safety for people who had 6 million of their brethren who were killed in World War II at concentration camps and in other, loathsome ways. So, really, this is crazy for a Jew like myself to hear this and to see how the left has embraced itself with these anti-democratic Palestinians and then tried to trot out this idea that they are oppressed, and they are oppressed. They're oppressed by their own government. By the Palestinian Authority. But it's so weird how, black is white and white is black when you start looking at a lot of the sort of left-wing philosophies and points of view.
Well, you and I could probably talk about these kind of things all day. I have a couple more questions in on my page here. So what are some of the big life lessons that you've learned along the way in the course of your career?
Well, I think that one of them is to follow your heart, because I followed my heart into going into journalism, and for a long time I sort of repressed it. I think that if you have a dream, maybe you can't get it today, but figure out a way you can take that first step toward that dream. I think that is probably the life lesson that I've learned, and it's a big one.
Yeah. Wow. And I think that is such an important thing for anyone to know and understand, that if you, and I've kind of done that in what I'm doing. I've when I first made my first documentary, it was an idea. It was just, let's make a documentary about the wheat harvest. And it was like, how do I do that? Well, I kind of figured it out and went out and did it. And so I think what you said there is very, very true. It's good advice. So what are some of the books or maybe podcasts, or who are some of the people that have most influenced you along the way?
Well, it's not a podcast, but I worked for 6 years for Ralph Nader. And while a lot of people would say, well, how can you go and, idolize that guy? Well, Ralph taught me a lot of skill sets. One of them was how to take an idea and a problem and how to research it, which is my investigative reporting side, and then how to use that for social change in terms of righting wrongs. And so I learned that. But the other thing about Nader, which, there's two parts to Nader's critique. The first is how unresponsive government is to the American people. And in the 1970s and 80s, when I was with him, that was very much the case as it is today, how government bureaucracies favor special interests, how the little guy, the little man and woman are completely axed out of the policy making that would benefit them in terms of Congress or in terms of the administration, departments and agencies. So that's like a whole critique that he taught me, and I think it's true today. So I really benefited, working sort of at his knee and learning that. Where Ralph and I disagree is that he thinks that the solution is more government, and I think the solution is less government.
So when the movie about your life is made, and I'd be happy to produce that, what will the log line be? A log line in a movie is that one sentence description that tells the story in one phrase or sentence. So when the movie of your life is made, what would that log line say?
Well, actually, it was a friend of mine who is a editor-in-chief of another publication who threw the line out, and I think it's probably right, because this year, I came here in 1969 for college, and now it's 2019, and he just said spontaneously, it shows you what a creative genius he is. He said, 50 years living in the swamp.
I like that. And
I've seen so much of the swamp. I didn't know that was the word that one should put to it, but I've seen so much wrongdoing, self-serving, selfish actions that help narrow political groups, but not the broad American public. I've seen so much of this. The revolving door where members of Congress go and join lobbying firms, and then they get hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, big contracts, and they're now lobbying their friends. And this is done by Republicans and Democrats, by the way. This is just not a Democratic problem.
Yep.
And I didn't understand all of that stuff at the time. I saw it, but I didn't put it together. And I think that this swamp probably is a apt description.
Mm-hmm. So who's someone who maybe on the surface you had one idea about them, but when you met them, interviewed them, they surprised you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Who did I meet that surprised me? I mean, I'll tell you one person that surprised me. Yes. So one of the things that I would do as a field producer for Good Morning America is when we had a very senior person, certainly the President of the United States on our show, or a senator, or congressman, a secretary, or cabinet member, or other important pieces, even actors and actresses that were going to be on, I usually accompanied them, and I got them set, and I made sure that they were at the right place, and that and I would set the shooting for what the shot would look like, etc. So one year, it was very early in the morning, and we were going to have on Senator Robert Dole, and we were going to have Senator George Mitchell. And Robert Dole is a Republican. He actually once ran for president under the Republican ticket. And Senator George Mitchell was at the time the head of the U.S. Senate, and was a Democrat. He was the leading Democrat in the Senate. So our notion was that George Mitchell was like a fatherly, thoughtful person, and that Bob Dole was a person who was a Republican, venal, didn't have good values or anything of that sort. So the two of them come up because we're going to have them on together. And we were not the only ones doing the show. The Today Show was going to do an interview, and CBS This Morning was going to do an interview. So we were all of our cameras were set up, and we all had and we had quite a few people there. And George Mitchell shows up late, and he's gruff, and he's really very rude. But beforehand comes Senator Dole. Now, a lot of people don't know that Senator Dole in World War II lost the use of his arm. Mm-hmm. It hangs really listlessly by his side, and it's one of the reasons why he was actually one of the people advancing the Americans for Disability Act. Well, with his good arm, he had in him, which he carried, not an aid, a big jug of coffee and a bag of muffins for the crew, for all of us.
Wow.
And he's carrying it. He's a disabled person, but in his one useful arm, he's carrying both of them. The aides are falling behind, but they're not carrying it, which you think they would do. He carried it and personally gave it to all of us. He personally gave it to me. And he was charming, and he was humble, and he was a nice guy. He's the kind of guy you'd like maybe have beer with or something.
Right.
And it just totally flipped their public images in the liberal Washington press, And so I found this guy, Bob Dole, to be a sweet, generous, thoughtful, caring person who had a wicked sense of humor. He was very funny, also self-deprecating humor. And here was George Mitchell, who everybody loved, and he was just really this rude SOB, and it was just really, it had a prima donna kind of portrayal of himself. And so that meeting, and then I interviewed Bob Dole a number of other times, including in his apartment with his wife, Elizabeth Dole. We did like a little day in the life of Bob Dole, and he was like that the same way. So, and by the way, Jerry Ford, who I mentioned in the very beginning, calling himself, I interviewed Ford a number of other times, and he was just also a down-to-earth kind of guy. So both of those people have been vilified by our liberal press. Of course, when they die, they're going to say they're saints. But before that, they're all, terrible, heartless, senseless people. And yet, when I met them, I was just so shocked about how different they were in real life.
It's good to meet people like that who surprise you, and it's always a refreshing thing. And it's also disappointing sometimes when someone's been put on a pedestal and admired, and they come off in a totally different way as well.
Yeah. And one person who well, I won't go down that road, but yes, there are people also on the other side that you just sort of you admire, and then you meet them, and you realize, just what a phony they really
Right.
are.
So, final question. What's the next big thing for you?
Well, it's very interesting. I'm probably going to continue my investigative reporting, but I'm also, and I don't know if this is going to happen, but I've been invited to actually be part of a startup that's going to be a new magic show and
Ah,
circus combined that will use high technology and will be sort of like Cirque du Soleil, but will be different in many many ways. It'll have live animals, but they'll also have magic, and they'll have all sorts of, and they'll have a story theme for each of them. And so I've been invited to be part of the team. I have accepted. The other thing, though, that I'm going to be really working on, I think, and I'll be writing a lot, it will be about anti-Semitism and also the hatred that the left, but other people, including some on the right, who hate Israel for some reason, and they all have their excuses, but, they had their excuses in 1492 when the Spanish Inquisition came by and all the Jews were either expelled or they were required to believe another religion, or during World War II. I mean, each group had their own particular explanation about why we should hate Jews and why Jews are evil. And it's just part of the ancient animus that people have had toward this small little group of people. I mean, we're very small, maybe 1 or 2% of the world's population, maybe probably 1% is probably better. Yet we've had, I think, a very positive impact on creating just societies, and yet we're vilified left and right by many people.
yeah. Well, Richard, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program. I've always enjoyed getting together with you and talking with you. So, any predictions on the upcoming presidential race?
Well, I think that given the drumbeat of the media, one would be against Donald Trump. One would be thinking that Trump was, toast, that he's a one-term president, and there's a lot of atmospherics that are against him for sure. A lot of really terrible stuff being thrown at him by his opponents. So in a way, in a neutral environment, I would say that a Democrat could probably waltz in. But the Democrats have decided not to just simply oppose Trump, but to now go into this complete left-wing jihad of the Green New Deal, about free college and free this and free that, and about reparations and about supporting LGBTQ, even in educational classrooms for youngsters. I mean, you name it. And they're going way off into the deep end of left-wing fantasies. And it makes them feel really good to all just sort of say, yes, we're socialists. Yes, we're this and that. But I think that in light of these developments, what could have been a close election actually will be a landslide, and that Donald Trump will win a landslide. He may not win the 49 states, but he will win a huge number of states from coast to coast. Much bigger, I think, win than he had against Hillary Clinton. There is a saying that a diplomat made of another political situation, but I'm going to use it, and that is, the Democrats never fail to miss an opportunity. They will always, when they are given an opportunity, they will blow it. I think they're blowing it. I think that they're actually blowing it. And the one guy who probably could really give him the run for his money, Joe Biden, is being absolutely torn up to bits by the Democrats. And remember, this is the same Democrats that said, we have a promise, an oath that we will not attack each other. Well, that didn't last long, did it?
I guess not.
So I think that if things continue the way that they are going, the trajectory that they're pursuing right now, I think that Donald Trump will very handsomely get a second term.
Well, there you go. We'll have to come back after the election in a couple of years and do a follow-up with you.
Okay, very good.
And get some reflections. Richard, thank you so much for joining us on the My Story podcast. I really appreciate it. You always have fascinating stories, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. You are a very talented guy, and I admire the work that you do. You're just a great guy, Conrad.
Richard, thanks so much for spending time with us today. It's always a pleasure talking with you and hearing your stories. And I can't wait to catch up with you after the election to see if your prediction came true. Next time on the My Story podcast, I'll have my friend and fellow filmmaker and musician Ingrid Serban. Ingrid is an accomplished musician and a voting member of the Grammy Awards. Yes, she votes for the Grammys. And she's an accomplished filmmaker to boot. Her new documentary film, Free Trip to Egypt, which she directed, premiered a few weeks ago in New York and LA, and she's in post-production on another film that will come out likely next year. So please join me next time for this interview with Ingrid Serban as we talk about creativity, following our passion, and a lot more. That's next time on the My Story podcast. The My Story podcast is produced by Conjo Studios, an award-winning video production company whose focus is helping you tell your story. Visit conjostudios.com, click on the blue Get a Quote button, and let them know what you need. Then watch your stress melt away as their team does the magic of producing your next video, film, or podcast project. That's conjostudios.com, telling stories that matter. And if you enjoy the music on today's show, it's from my friend Drew Davidson. You can get all of his music on iTunes or Spotify or at drewdavidson.com. Last, if you have an idea for an interview you want to hear, send me a message and I'll see what I can do. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you again next week on the My Story podcast.